The cartel lieutenant thought he was being clever when he unloaded Staff Sergeant Zoey Brooks from the truck bed and left her zip-tied in the Sonoran Desert, 90 kilometers from anything that could be called civilization, with no water, no gear, and the afternoon sun already climbing toward its brutal 118-degree peak. "You Delta Force," he said in heavily accented English, standing over her as she knelt in the sand, her hands bound behind her back. "Always so tough, so elite, but elite needs water like everyone else. Yes?" He laughed, the sound harsh in the desert silence. "Let's see how tough you are after 3 days in the sun. Maybe you crawl back to us, maybe you beg, maybe you just die." Through the sweat already stinging her eyes, Zoe looked up at him with the kind of calm that came from 7 years in the most brutal military unit in the world. The desert stretched in all directions, endless sand, scattered creosote bushes, distant mountains shimmering in heat waves. No shade, no water, no equipment, just her, the desert, and the training that had prepared her for exactly this scenario. The cartel had taken her M4 carbine when they had ambushed her team 6 hours ago, had stripped her of her plate carrier, her sidearm, her radio, her GPS, every piece of equipment that made a modern soldier effective. They thought they had reduced her to just another person, vulnerable and mortal. They were about to learn what Delta Force selection really taught. "Nothing to say?" The lieutenant kicked sand at her. "No threats? No brave words about American military coming to rescue you?" Zoe remained silent, her tactical mind already working. The sun was northwest, maybe 2 p.m. based on angle and heat intensity. That meant she had approximately 5 hours until sunset, maybe 8 hours until full darkness. The cartel compound where they were holding her team was roughly 90 kilometers east. She'd counted the truck's speed and time during transport, building a mental map of the route. The desert temperature was currently around 115 degrees, would peak at 118 to 120, then drop to maybe 60 at night. Humans could survive 3 hours in direct sunlight without water in these conditions. 3 days was a death sentence without serious survival skills, but Zoe had more than survival skills. She had Delta Force training. "Your team is already dead," the lieutenant continued, trying to provoke a reaction. "We interrogate them now. By tomorrow we know everything about American operations. And you? You die alone in the desert, no rescue, no honor, just heat and thirst and pain." He walked back to the truck, climbed in, and the vehicle roared away, leaving a dust plume that hung in the still air before slowly dispersing. The sound of the engine faded, replaced by the absolute silence of the Sonoran Desert, a silence so complete it was almost physical. Zoe waited until the truck was completely out of sight, then she moved. The zip ties on her wrists were standard heavy-duty plastic, meant to restrain, hard to break through brute force. But Delta Force selection included a week in survival school where they taught techniques that most operators never learned. She contorted her arms, dislocated her left thumb with practiced efficiency, slipped her smaller hand through the tie, then popped her thumb back into joint with a move that made her grunt but was otherwise routine. Free. She stood slowly, surveying her situation with the kind of clinical assessment that separated Delta operators from conventional forces. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, no immediate landmarks, no water sources visible, no shade closer than those distant mountains, probably 15 kilometers away. But Zoe wasn't seeing an empty desert. She was seeing resources. The creosote bushes scattered across the landscape could provide minimal shade and were indicators of where water might collect during rare rains. The sand itself held moisture a few feet down, not drinkable but useful for evaporative cooling. The barrel cacti dotting the terrain contained moisture that could sustain life if extracted properly. And the wildlife she could hear, birds, insects, the distant call of a coyote, all pointed toward water sources and provided navigation cues. Most importantly, She had knowledge. Delta Force didn't just teach you to shoot and fight, they taught you to survive, to adapt, to turn any environment into an asset rather than an obstacle. The cartel lieutenant had left her in the desert to die. Instead, he'd put her exactly where Delta Force training made her most dangerous, in an environment where technology didn't matter, where rank didn't matter, where nothing mattered except the ability to endure and persist and refuse to quit. What happened over the next 72 hours would be analyzed by survival instructors, discussed in classified briefings, and become legend among special operations forces. Because Zoe didn't just survive the desert, she turned it into a weapon. And then she used that weapon to take down an entire cartel operation and rescue her team, all without firing a single shot. 96 hours earlier, the briefing had taken place in a nondescript building in El Paso, Texas, where the desert heat outside was barely kept at bay by overworked air conditioning, and the atmosphere inside was thick with tension. The man running the briefing introduced himself as Agent Morrison, with the kind of deliberately vague government authority that screamed DEA, or Homeland Security. Mid-40s, weathered face, the exhausted look of someone fighting a war that never made headlines. The target is the Salazar cartel's distribution hub, Morrison began, pulling up satellite imagery of a compound in the Sonoran Desert. Specifically, this facility approximately 90 kilometers south of the border. They're moving $50 million worth of fentanyl per month through this location. That's enough to kill 10 million people. Lieutenant Colonel David Kane, the Delta Force team leader, studied the imagery with intense focus. At 43, Kane was a towering figure at 6'3", with close-cropped gray hair, a weathered face lined by 2 decades of combat operations, and the kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively follow his lead. He'd earned his reputation bringing teams home from missions across Afghanistan, Iraq, and a dozen countries that never appeared in official reports. What makes this Delta Force priority instead of DEA or Border Patrol? 3 reasons, Morrison replied. First, the Salazar cartel has acquired military-grade weapons, M240 machine guns, grenade launchers, possibly shoulder-fired missiles. Second, they're holding 3 American hostages kidnapped from a border town last week. Third, intelligence suggests they've built hardened defensive positions that would result in massive casualties for conventional assault. "So you need us to do the impossible," said Master Sergeant Zoey Brooks from the second row, her tone matter-of-fact rather than arrogant. At 28, she was the youngest operator in the unit and one of only 3 women to ever complete Delta Force selection, a process with a 90% failure rate that broke most men who attempted it. "Essentially, yes," Morrison confirmed. "We need surgical precision, minimal casualties, hostage rescue, and drug interdiction, the kind of mission Delta was created for." Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington, the team's heavy weapons specialist, leaned forward. "What's the security situation?" Approximately 30 to 40 cartel soldiers, all armed with military weapons, some with combat experience from various conflicts. They operate in shifts, maintain defensive positions, and have proven willing to fight rather than flee. Zoe continued studying the satellite imagery, her analytical mind already identifying problems. The compound was well positioned on high ground, with clear sight lines in all directions. Approaching undetected would be nearly impossible in the flat desert terrain, and the hardened defensive positions Morrison mentioned looked like they had been designed by someone with military engineering knowledge. "What's the water situation?" she asked, a question that made several team members look at her oddly. Morrison pulled up more detailed imagery. "There's a well in the compound providing water. The surrounding desert is typical Sonoran, extremely arid, daytime temperatures exceeding 115 degrees, limited vegetation. So anyone operating in that environment needs constant hydration," Zoe observed. which means their defensive positions are tethered to the compound. They can't range far without returning for water. Correct, Morrison confirmed, which is why we're planning a night operation when temperatures are lower and we can approach with less risk of heat casualties. After the briefing, Zoey worked on her equipment with the meticulous attention that had earned her the nickname Professor among her teammates. Her M4 carbine was stripped, cleaned, and reassembled with practiced precision. Her kit was organized so she could find any item in complete darkness by touch alone. Lieutenant Colonel Kane found her in the team room. "You're worried about the desert." "I'm worried about everything, sir. That's why I'm still breathing." Zoey didn't look up from her work. "But yes, the desert is a factor. High heat, no cover, limited water sources. If anything goes wrong during approach, we're looking at serious heat casualties. We're inserting at night to avoid that. Sir, with respect, night in the Sonoran Desert is still 80 to 90 degrees in summer. We'll be carrying 60 pounds of gear across rough terrain. Even at night, dehydration is a factor." Kane was quiet for a moment, his deep voice measured when he spoke. "You grew up in Arizona, didn't you?" "Yes, sir. Phoenix. Spent a lot of time in the Sonoran Desert, learned to respect it early." Zoey finally looked up from her carbine. "The desert isn't just terrain, sir. It's an active threat. It kills people who underestimate it, and it kills faster than bullets if you're not prepared." "Which is why you're on this team," Kane replied, his expression showing the confidence of a commander who trusted his people's expertise. "Your survival skills are why you passed selection when 90% of candidates fail. Trust them, and if things go sideways, use them." The insertion happened at 0200 hours, 8 operators landing via helicopter 15 kilometers from the target compound, then moving on foot through the desert night. The terrain was brutal even in darkness, loose sand that made walking exhausting, scattered rocks that could twist ankles, and enough elevation change that what looked flat on satellite imagery was actually a series of gradual rises and falls. Zoey moved with practiced efficiency, her body adapted to the desert environment through years of experience. She could feel the temperature, probably 85 degrees, and humidity, maybe 20%, and calculated her water needs automatically. The team was carrying enough hydration for the approach, the operation, and the exfiltration, but with minimal margin for error. They reached their observation post at 0445 hours, establishing hide positions that provided clear view of the compound while offering concealment from any patrols. Through night vision, Zoey could see the facility clearly. 3 main buildings, defensive positions with machine guns, guards on rotating patrols. "Sniper 1 in position," she reported quietly. Her role was overwatch. Eliminate sentries, cover the assault team's approach, provide suppressive fire if things went loud. "Copy, Sniper 1, Kane's voice came back, steady and controlled. "Hold position. Assault element is moving to breach point." The plan was straightforward. Wait until 0600 when guard change created a brief vulnerability, then execute a rapid entry to secure hostages and neutralize threats. Zoey's job was to make sure no alarm was raised during the approach. At 0537 hours, everything went wrong. A cartel patrol, one not shown on the intelligence, emerged from a gully the team hadn't known existed. They walked directly toward the Delta Force positions, close enough that avoiding contact was impossible. "Contact front!" Washington's voice crackled over the radio as the firefight erupted. Muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by chaos. The compound came alive, lights blazing, alarms sounding, cartel soldiers pouring out of buildings with weapons ready. What should have been a surgical strike became a desperate gunfight. "Fall back!" Kane ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos with command authority. "Bound and cover withdrawal." But falling back meant crossing open ground under fire. Zoey provided covering fire, her M4 dropping cartel soldiers who tried to pursue. But there were too many, and they had prepared defensive positions while Delta Force was exposed in the open. "We're getting flanked," called Sergeant First Class Jennifer Martinez, the team's medic. "They're using the terrain to cut off our withdrawal route." Zoey saw the tactical problem clearly. The cartel had superior numbers and position. They were executing a textbook encirclement, using the terrain they knew intimately to trap an enemy in unfamiliar ground. She made a decision. "I'm going to draw their attention," she announced. "Give you time to break contact." "Negative!" Kane's voice was sharp with command authority. "We don't split the team." "Sir, they're about to overrun our position. Either I draw fire or we all get captured." Zoey was already moving, firing as she displaced to the north, away from her team's withdrawal route. "I'll evade and link up at Rally Point Charlie in 12 hours. "Zoey, that's 90 kilometers through hostile territory in daytime desert heat." "Yes, sir, I'm aware." She fired again, dropping 2 cartel soldiers who were moving to flank the team. "See you at Rally Point Charlie." "Don't be late." She broke away from the team, running through the desert night while firing controlled bursts that forced the cartel forces to orient on her position. Behind her she heard Kane's voice. "All elements withdraw. Zoey's bought us time, don't waste it." The cartel took the bait. Vehicles roared to life, lights sweeping across the desert, searching for the lone operator who'd drawn their attention. Zoey ran, using every bit of desert navigation skill she possessed to move through terrain that would break a normal person. She lasted 3 hours before the cartel cordoned off her escape routes and forced her into a box canyon. She fought until her ammunition ran dry, then until they overwhelmed her with numbers. They stripped her of every piece of equipment, bound her hands, and threw her in a truck bed for transport back to their compound. That's when the cartel lieutenant made his fatal mistake. Instead of taking her to the compound for interrogation, he decided to make an example of her, decided to leave her in the desert to die slowly, to show his men what happened to American operators who dared to challenge them. He dumped her 90 kilometers from the compound with no water, no equipment, no hope of survival, and unknowingly created the exact scenario where Delta Force training made her most dangerous. The sun was a physical force, pressing down with weight that went beyond mere heat. Zoey estimated it was now 3 p.m., and the temperature had climbed past 117 degrees. Under these conditions, without water, most people would be unconscious or dead within 3 hours. But Zoey wasn't most people. Delta Force selection included a phase called Survival Week, where candidates were dropped in hostile environments with minimal equipment and told to survive and evade. Zoey had completed that phase in the Utah desert in July, where temperatures exceeded 110 degrees and water sources were deliberately hidden or removed. She'd learned that survival wasn't about toughness or willpower. It was about knowledge and systematic application of that knowledge. First priority: prevent immediate heat casualties. She was already sweating heavily, which meant rapid fluid loss. Direct sun exposure would accelerate that to critical levels within an hour. She moved to the nearest creosote bush, a desert plant with deep roots that indicated underground water. The bush provided minimal shade, but every degree of temperature reduction mattered. She dug into the sand beneath the bush, going down about 18 inches until she reached cooler, slightly damp sand. She stripped off her uniform top, leaving her in just her undershirt, and buried the top in the damp sand. The fabric would absorb moisture from the sand, not enough to drink, but enough to create an evaporative cooling garment. After 15 minutes, she pulled it out and wore it damp. The evaporation would drop her skin temperature by several critical degrees. Second priority: find water. She had maybe 24 hours before dehydration became life-threatening, 48 before it became fatal. But Delta Force training had taught her that the desert was never as empty as it appeared. Zoe began moving in a search pattern, looking for specific indicators. Desert wildlife always revealed water sources. She watched bird flight patterns. Birds flew toward water in morning and evening. She looked for insect activity. Bees and wasps needed water daily. She examined animal tracks. Fresh tracks often led to water sources. After an hour of careful observation, she spotted what she needed: a game trail, faint but clear to someone trained to look for it. Multiple species had used this trail recently: jackrabbits, coyotes, possibly bighorn sheep based on the track size. They were all heading southeast toward a small canyon in the distance. She followed the trail, moving during the hottest part of the day because she needed water before nightfall. The heat was brutal, like walking through an oven, but she maintained a steady pace, using breathing techniques to conserve moisture and energy. The game trail led her to a narrow canyon with steep rock walls. In the canyon's deepest shadow, she found what she needed: a seep spring, barely more than wet rock, but precious water nonetheless. It was collecting in a small depression at the rate of maybe a cup per hour. Zoe used her uniform shirt as a filter, wringing water through the fabric to remove sediment, then drinking slowly. The water tasted of minerals and earth, but it was life. She drank a liter over the course of 2 hours, letting her body absorb it gradually rather than overwhelming her system. With immediate survival secured, she could focus on the next phase: equipment. The cartel had taken her weapons and gear, but the desert provided its own tools if you knew where to look. Zoe spent the late afternoon gathering resources. From a dead saguaro cactus, she harvested woody ribs that could serve as tools or weapons. Saguaro ribs were straight, strong, and could be sharpened to create effective spears or digging implements. From creosote bushes, she collected resin that could serve as adhesive and waterproofing. Creosote resin was naturally antibacterial and could seal wounds or attach stone points to wooden shafts. From barrel cacti, she carefully extracted moisture using techniques that wouldn't harm the plants but would provide additional hydration. From the canyon walls, she found flint-like rock that could be knapped into cutting edges. By the time the sun set and temperatures dropped to the 70s, Zoe had created a basic survival kit: water source identified and accessible, primitive tools fashioned, materials gathered for shelter if needed. But she wasn't interested in survival. She was interested in mission completion. Her team was being held at that cartel compound 90 kilometers away. The cartel thought she was dead or dying in the desert. They would interrogate her teammates, extract intelligence, and probably execute them within 72 hours, which meant Zoe had 3 days to cross 90 kilometers of Sonoran Desert, infiltrate a heavily defended cartel compound, and rescue her team without weapons, without equipment, without support, using nothing but Delta Force training and the desert itself. She began moving east at sunset, using the stars for navigation. The Sonoran Desert at night was actually beautiful, temperature dropping to comfortable levels, stars so bright they provided genuine illumination, nocturnal wildlife emerging to hunt and forage. Zoe moved with purpose, covering approximately 5 kilometers per hour across terrain that would slow most people to half that pace. She navigated by stars: Polaris for north, the Summer Triangle for orientation, the Milky Way for reference. She moved from shadow to shadow, using night vision that came from letting her eyes fully adapt to darkness rather than from electronic goggles. She covered 40 kilometers the first night, stopping only when the eastern sky began to lighten. By her estimation, she was now 50 kilometers from the compound, halfway there. She found shelter in a small cave formed by overhanging rocks, dug into cooler sand beneath, and slept in short bursts during the heat of the day. Her body was adapting to desert rhythms, active at night when temperatures allowed efficient movement, dormant during day when conservation was critical. By the second night, she was 30 kilometers from the compound. She could see its lights on the horizon, a beacon drawing her forward. She began observing from a distance, using elevation and darkness to remain undetected. The compound's security was focused outward, expecting threats from roads and approaches. They weren't watching the deep desert to the west. Why would they? Nothing could approach from that direction without vehicles, and vehicles were easy to spot. They weren't expecting someone who'd crossed 60 kilometers on foot through conditions that should have killed her. On the third night, 72 hours after being left for dead, Zoey moved on the compound. She had no weapons except primitive tools fashioned from desert materials, no communications, no backup, no support. What she had was knowledge, training, and an intimate understanding of both the desert and human psychology. The compound's water came from a well with a pump system powered by a generator. Zoey had identified this on a reconnaissance, heard the generator running, saw personnel drawing water regularly. It was their lifeline, their critical vulnerability. Using skills learned in Delta Force's unconventional warfare training, she approached the well during the dead hours between midnight and dawn. The guard rotation was lightest then, and the generator's noise masked her movements. She contaminated the water supply using natural desert toxins she'd harvested, not enough to kill, but enough to cause severe gastrointestinal distress. Within 12 hours, the entire compound would be incapacitated by illness that looked like food poisoning or waterborne disease. Then she waited. The sun rose on her fourth day in the desert. She was dehydrated, exhausted, sunburned, and operating on maybe 6 hours of sleep total. By conventional standards, she should be non-functional. By Delta Force standards, she was just getting started. The compound descended into chaos by midday. Personnel were violently ill, unable to maintain security positions, overwhelmed by the sudden epidemic. The cartel leadership was panicking, assuming biological warfare or poisoning by a rival organization. Zoey infiltrated during the confusion, moving through a compound that had gone from fortress to crisis center. She navigated by memory and observation, avoiding the few personnel still functional, heading toward the building where logic and intelligence suggested hostages would be held. She found her team in a secured room in the main building. Kane, Washington, Martinez, and 4 others, all bound but unharmed. They looked up in shock when she appeared in the doorway, her uniform torn and sun-bleached, her face burned dark, carrying nothing but primitive weapons fashioned from desert materials. "Zoey?" Kane's voice was disbelieving, his normally controlled expression showing genuine shock. "How are you alive?" "Delta Force training, sir," she replied, using a sharpened stone tool to cut their zip ties. "Turns out the desert is pretty useful once you understand it." "The entire compound is sick," Washington observed. "What did you do?" "Contaminated their water supply with natural toxins. They'll be incapacitated for 24 hours, then recover fully. No permanent harm, but definitely not combat effective." "You took down an entire cartel compound by poisoning their water?" Martinez sounded amazed. "Using what?" "Desert plants, knowledge, and the fact that they depend on that well. Zoey helped the last teammate free. Now we need to move before they recover. There are vehicles in the motor pool. We take one and drive north to the border." "You're insane," Washington said, but he was smiling. "Completely insane. I love it. The escape was anticlimactic. They simply walked through a compound too ill to mount resistance, took a truck, and drove north across the desert. By the time cartel reinforcements arrived, the Delta Force team was across the border and en route to debriefing." The debriefing lasted 3 days. Zoey sat through endless questions about her survival, her methods, her infiltration of the compound without weapons. "You contaminated their water supply using natural desert toxins," one analyst said, reviewing her report. "That's chemical warfare. That's using natural resources tactically, Zoe corrected. Everything I used occurs naturally in the Sonoran Desert. I simply understood which plants produce which compounds and how to extract them. Where did you learn that? Delta Force Selection, Survival Week. Combined with childhood experience in the Arizona desert, I grew up learning which plants were dangerous, which were useful, which contained water or medicines or toxins. You crossed 90 kilometers in 3 days through desert heat without equipment. 70 kilometers, actually. I was already 20 kilometers from the compound when they dumped me. That's still remarkable. That's training, Zoe replied. Delta Force doesn't just teach you to shoot. They teach you to survive, adapt, and complete the mission regardless of circumstances, by poisoning an entire compound, by using environmental factors to neutralize threats without firing a shot. That's asymmetric warfare. That's using knowledge as a weapon. 2 weeks later, Zoe stood in dress uniform, receiving the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation mentioned extraordinary ingenuity and tactical innovation resulting in mission success despite being stripped of all equipment and abandoned in hostile environment. But what the citation didn't mention, what remained classified, was the detailed analysis of her techniques. Military survival instructors were already incorporating her methods into advanced training. Special operations units were studying how she'd turned environmental knowledge into tactical advantage. She'd proven that an operator's most valuable weapon wasn't their rifle or their gear. It was their training and their refusal to accept that any situation was impossible. Zoe found herself in the Australian outback, not as an operator, but as the lead instructor for a joint special operations survival course bringing together Delta Force, SAS, and JTF-2 operators. The red desert stretched to the horizon, different from the Sonoran, but equally hostile to the unprepared. The desert isn't your enemy, she told the assembled special operators, most of whom had decades of experience but were here to learn her specific techniques. It's neutral. It will kill you if you're ignorant, but it will sustain you if you're knowledgeable. Everything you need to survive exists in every environment. You just need to understand how to find it and use it. She pulled up photos from her ordeal in Mexico, not the classified operation details, but general imagery of Sonoran Desert terrain. This is where I spent 4 days after being left for dead with no equipment. The cartel thought abandoning me there was a death sentence. Instead, it was the environment where my training mattered most. How much of survival is physical versus mental? One SAS operator asked with a British accent. Wrong question, Zoe replied. Survival isn't physical or mental. It's knowledge applied systematically. Your mind identifies resources, your training provides techniques to exploit those resources, and your body executes the plan. They work together, not separately. She walked them through her methods, finding water through wildlife observation, creating evaporative cooling garments, fashioning tools from natural materials, extracting compounds from plants for tactical use. The key principle is this, she concluded. Never accept that your situation is hopeless. Every environment contains resources. Every problem has solutions. Your job as special operations personnel is to identify those resources and solutions faster than your enemy can exploit their advantages. After the class, Lieutenant Colonel Kane found her. He had been given command of an entire squadron after the successful Mexico operation, and Zoe had been offered positions throughout special operations community to share her experience. You've changed how we teach survival, Kane said, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the Australian sun. Not just Delta, but across all special operations. The Australians, the Brits, the Canadians, everyone wants to learn your methods. Because they're learning that survival isn't about toughness, Zoe replied. It's about knowledge. Once you remove the mystique and teach systematic techniques, it becomes achievable. The cartel lieutenant who dumped you in the desert, Kane said carefully, his deep voice measured. "We got him in a follow-up operation. He couldn't believe you'd survived, kept saying it was impossible." "It was improbable," Zoey corrected. "But Delta Force trains for improbable scenarios. That's the whole point of selection, to find operators who can succeed when everything goes wrong." "He asked how you did it, said he needed to understand." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you did it the same way you do everything, with training, knowledge, and the absolute refusal to quit." Kane paused. "He said that's not human, that's superhuman." "It's not superhuman," Zoey said. "It's just what happens when you combine good training with someone stubborn enough to apply it. The desert didn't make me special. It just revealed what Delta Force selection had already built." She looked out at the training grounds, where operators from 3 nations were struggling through survival exercises, learning to see resources where they'd previously seen only hostile terrain. "Most candidates fail Delta selection," Kane observed. 90% quit before completing the course. "Because they're waiting to be transformed into superhumans," Zoey replied. "But Delta Force doesn't create superhumans. It creates operators who understand that success is about knowledge, preparation, and the systematic application of skills. Once candidates understand that, selection becomes achievable instead of mythical." "Is that what you tell them?" "Every chance I get, because the cartel lieutenant was wrong. What I did in the desert wasn't superhuman. It was thoroughly human, just trained to a level most people don't realize is possible." 3 months later, Zoey deployed again, this time to the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, on a mission that would remain classified for decades. The terrain was brutal, the mission parameters were nearly impossible, and conventional wisdom said the operation couldn't succeed. She walked into that desert with her training, her knowledge, and the absolute certainty that the environment would provide everything she needed to complete the mission. Because that's what Delta Force really teaches, not that you're superhuman, but that with proper training and refusal to quit, the impossible becomes merely difficult. And difficult is just another word for the mission. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you can subscribe to see more incredible stories like this one.